Okay, thank you, Jacob. And thank you, Council, and our special guest, Attorney Cliff Shepard. This is the first meeting for the City Council to start going through the process of doing a full charter review with the hopes of completing it and having all of the language drafted prior to May 1st for inclusion into the November 2022 election cycle. Here comes the mayor. So with this being the kickoff meeting, I expect that there will be probably a couple of bugs and hiccups through the course of the meeting as we gain our stride as to how each of these meetings will be conducted going forward. So it's good that the first one is only 3 sections long, sections 1 through 3. But the intention is to basically go through each of the sections and see if the council has any discussion or recommendations, or if there's any input from staff or recommendations from our council as to what we should do with each section as we move forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cliff Shepard to maybe shed some light as well on the process that we may be using going forward. And then I'm sure from there he will dive into section 1 and we'll see how the first night goes. Cliff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys. It's been an interesting last few weeks. So this is definitely better than that. I wanted to share with you that this process, as you know, I've been through a bunch of times, and in a moment, I'm going to get to share the screen and put up for you the sections 1 through 3, along with things that I think are worthy of discussion. Discussion meaning it's up to you to decide if you want to do anything or nothing or something. And those are based on those recommendations for discussion are based on my history of having done this and either personally seen problems come up in cities that I represent, or otherwise being aware of cities that had problems that I don't represent, but I happen to know about the problems. So I have no, as they say, dog in the hunt, so to speak, but that's why when I review them, that's the eye that I look through. Now, that does not mean, and just as this is a precursor, it'll apply to every section, every time we go through any of these meetings in the future, but I wanted to get it on the table. It does not mean that you don't get to bring not only things that relate to these sections, but other things to the table if you choose to do that. It's just that by having a section structure, we managed to get through the whole charter. Whereas if we just go kind of free for all and just say, well, let's talk about this or that or the other thing, we may never finish the actual charter. So that's kind of the idea. And with that, if Jacob would allow me to share the screen, I will pull up what I have for discussion.
You should already have access to that, Cliff, so you should be good.
I do. It says, there we go, share. Okay, is that everybody can see that? Okay, good. I see nodding heads. I don't know why I was waiting for actual sound. So the print is small for an old dude like me, but the most important part is where I say that areas for discussion on section 1 are none from me. Does anyone have anything on section 1 they want to discuss before we move to section 2 amongst the members of council? I see nodding the other way. Okay, if I don't know if Jacob can keep track of raised hands or however they do this on Zoom, it would be great, because I'm not sure that I can do that and manipulate the screen at the same time. Now on section 2, enumerated powers.
So we do have one raised hand.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
We did have a discussion during our visioning session about possibly changing the name of the city. And so this would be the corporation by the name of.
Yes, this would be the place to go to do that.
Right. Oh, I know. But and so if we want to have that discussion of changing it to San Pablo Beach or something else, this is the section and time that we should have it.
I don't know that we're necessarily ready to have that conversation, but maybe can we set up maybe a parking lot system of things we need to go back to?
That's perfectly fine. And in fact, something so significant as a name change, which actually may dwarf everything else before it's all said and done, for Jack's Beach, you may want to have a special meeting of citizenry that's completely in addition to this charter review, to see what the ideas are, what people think, and where they stand, because that obviously is going to get people's attention. Is there any more further discussion on that issue for section 1, or do y'all want to take up the issue of whether you should have a special meeting, or you're going to take it up at a general meeting in the future? How do you want to proceed from here?
I think a special meeting would be good. And depending on how many changes we wish to make to the charter, I think it's also pertinent to get people to pay attention to the changes that we're trying to do, and changing the name of the city will get them to the polls and start looking at what it is that we are looking to change. So this might be the carrot to get them to start paying attention to a lot of the things that we'd normally get a glazed eye look for. So I'm fine with the mayor's idea of a parking lot, but we should think about this as a way of getting people interested in the charter changes, why it matters to them, and most importantly, to get them to the polls to, have their input.
Indeed. I agree with all of that. Is there any reason I shouldn't then proceed with section 2?
I just want to one last note on the item of name change. I have looked into some historical information on that, and there have been at least 2 previous attempts. So I'm trying to pull together some historic information just so everybody knows, so that when we are ready to talk about that in a more in-depth manner, we'll have that information.
I have a question as well.
Yes, sir.
It's mostly probably from Mike. And hey, Mike, instead of a special meeting, can this be added into a council briefing? I mean, we've got our plate full of special meetings for the next 6 months, and just trying to minimize some of that.
We could certainly make this a briefing topic if that's council's desire.
I'm just throwing it out there for everybody to think about instead of adding another meeting onto the books.
I can't see if there's a consensus by council because we're kind of shrunk down on the sides. Would you all like this to be brought back to a council briefing for discussion?
I think a council briefing could start the discussion, but it's got to go to a workshop and an open meeting for people's input. And I know that, yeah, we'd have every name from North Fort Lauderdale to like anything, or South Georgia, whatever. But people need to be able to have an input and buy-in into the name. And so depending on how that meeting's structured, I have no problem with starting with a briefing, but people do need to have some kind of a say before it would go on the ballot.
Yeah, I think that would be the starting point of the conversation. Or if council desires to go forward, to at least start the conversation about what the process would look like. Do you want to hold a series of public workshops? Are there specific names that you want to recommend? Do you want to take advice from the public as to what they want to see? So we'll go ahead and throw that on for a briefing. We obviously have a little bit of time here, but we'll get that on for all of you we'll start the ball rolling.
All right, can I proceed with section 2 now?
I have one question. I just raised my hand. Mike, if let's say we were to move forward with this name change and next year or so, what's the financial impact that this could have on the taxpayers?
Don't know.
Okay.
Jacob, are there any more raised hands?
I don't think so. Nope.
Okay. All right, we're going to proceed with section 2. If there comes something, if we need to backtrack, we certainly can. On section 2, at least from my view, the only thing that stood out is the reference to the 1950 federal census, which is highlighted and that should be highlighted on the screen in front of you. This is a discussion area, obviously, because the data is old, but that does not mean you need to change it. It means that if you chose to, using the current data or the most current data, would allow for additional liquor licenses if that is of interest to the council. I understand, in speaking to Mike, I think the current cap is at 13 based on the 50s census, the 1950s federal census data. But this is not a preference thing for me one way or the other. It's simply to point out that that's a reference that's quite a bit old.
It seems like a really oddly specific thing to have in the charter, and kind of randomly placed. I would support relooking at that. I don't know exactly what that answer would be. I don't think I want to bring it up to 1 per 550 people. We were quite a different city in 1950, but I do think that makes us look very outdated and out of touch. So I would support looking at that.
I agree. I think that I had my hand up. I don't know if anybody's seeing hands or not, but I think we should be brought up to the latest current standards. It does look like we're kind of dated, or that it's a policy that hasn't been looked at in quite some time. And I also agree with the mayor about with that one license for every however many. I think we kind of table that one, but at least bring up the census issue.
And as a comment to council, I just did the quick math. We currently have the 13 quota licenses that are applicable under those standards, which translates back into a population of a little over 7,000 people back in 1950. If we were to extrapolate out and keep the same ratio of 1 per 550, but use latest census data, that would be an expansion of quota licenses from 13 to approximately 44. If you wanted to maintain the status quo number of quota licenses, then you would update to the latest census, but you would make it comparable to 1 for every 1,900 of population. So if you wanted to have later data, but still keep the same number of licenses, then that's the ratio you'd be looking at. And if you wanted to expand, then that number would come down. The 1 per 1,900 would drop, depending on how many additional ones you wanted to allow.
Is this what's a standard ratio? I think this is something we need more information on.
Yeah, I would say that I'm sure the standard varies from community to community for the simple fact of what is it that you're trying to attract in terms of development or redevelopment. Obviously, for example, some communities are really craving new and additional restaurant choices, and the best restaurants also have a liquor license. And so if that was the city's desire, one way to help spur redevelopment in that area is to expand the availability of licenses so they can serve more than beer and wine with dinner. That's why it's not just a question of are there too many licenses, but it's also a question, or enough, it's a question of what kind of redevelopment would you like to see?
But these are licenses not for restaurants, but for sold bars.
It says vendors of
alcohol. Like we have the CRX and then we have the special licenses. The 13 are of bars that can just serve alcohol, no need for food at all. And
just serve, okay.
But you can also have a restaurant that serves food and sells all different types of alcohol, not just beer and wine. That's not included in these 13.
Yeah, we have the police chief on the call as well, who can provide a little bit of oversight. But Cliff, for your benefit, I think the way the community has interpreted this section over a number of decades is that this language is directly relatable to the quota licenses for liquor only. So it's bars and package stores, whereas the 4COP SRX extension for restaurants, such as a Chili's or a Carrabba's or any of those other types of establishments that have the combination of both food and alcohol, were not considered part of this. So Chief Smith is on the line, and I think he would concur that while we have 13 that fall under this particular category, we do have another 20 some odd that fall under the SRX extension. Chief Smith, does that sound correct?
Yes, that's correct. We currently have, and I gave you bad information, Mike, it's actually 12, called a 4COP quota license. We also call them legacy licenses, and they are limited by Chapter 2. And the reason there's confusion is because Hoptinger and Shim Sham, because of the physical location and the way they're put together, they actually share one, even though they have different names. It falls under one license. So that there's 12, and I gave you bad information, Mike. There's 13 establishments, 12 licenses, and the restaurant, like Carrabba's, is a 4COP SRX. which can be abused as a Rhino restaurant in name only. And that's the big argument between the 4 COPs and the 4 COP SRXs. And my feeling is this was put in very deliberately to limit the number of 4 COP licenses deliberately. And I think they deliberately, whenever this was put in, picked the 1950 census because they had an idea what they wanted to limit it to. And I think that's how the wording they came up with. Well, let's put it on a per capita population, and let's leave it at that in the 1950 census, which basically limits it forever. So I think that's why it was worded like that. I'm just guessing.
I'm certainly not interested in opening up 40 some odd quota licenses. However, I think what some of the unintended consequences that we have seen in this is that these 12 licenses are held by a very small group of people. They're extremely valuable now, to the point where if you have one, you're going to use it and you are going to try to maximize your revenue as much as you possibly can. And if you can't get one, and like right now, you really couldn't get one in Jacksonville Beach, you are going to operate. If you want to open a bar in Jacksonville Beach, you're going to operate a Rhino because there's just no other option. So I think that we need to expand this a little bit. If nothing else, either change the ratio, but take the year 1950 out of there because it just looks extremely out of date.
I agree with the mayor there, but I do want to note that we have to really start with our end goal in mind. What is what we're trying to achieve? And if we limit them, I agree with limiting them, but regardless of when we set a limit, that limit is going to be met. And once it's met, we're going to end up in that same situation that we're in. So I think the conversation really needs to start at what are we trying to achieve when it comes to full bar licenses? Because remember, in our LDC, bars cannot operate within 500 feet of each other. And that's not currently how it's working with rhinos and things such as that. So we need to really, we might want to table this one to a later discussion or postpone with a definite date, because this is really something that it's a much larger conversation than just the number of licenses. Do we want it based on population? Do we want it based on square mileage? Do we want it based on density of the city? Again, what is our ultimate goal here? And when we make that number, is that going to achieve our goal? And then if it does, we have to be able to identify what the unintended consequences are of having it set at that number. And so that's a rather deep discussion that I don't think anyone here is prepared to dive into this evening.
I do agree with Mayor and Councilmember Dumont. I think the 1950 federal consensus should be removed. I know for the one license for each 550 could be updated. Maybe instead of 1 550, maybe one per 1,200 individuals or square mileage or density. And a question that I have when I was reading this, as soon as it was emailed to us, is there a specific reason, Cliff, and if you can answer this, why it says intoxicating liquors or whiskey, not just liquors or spirits? Or is it something that was done a long, long time ago?
Well, I don't know when it was done, but I suspect it was quite a bit ago. I know it's been quite a while since y'all have had a charter review. And my guess is that they were trying to track whatever the language of the statutes were at the time that regulated these things and what they were called. But I don't know. But to your point, if we're going to look at this section, what stood out to me is the 1950 federal census reference because it's so old. But if you're going to go down the road of figuring out, okay, a new method, maybe we want to look at it from density, we want to look at it from square miles or whatever it is you want to change, then that would be a good time to also look at, okay, is spirits a broad enough term under the statutes as it exists today? And perhaps clarify, and I'll point out the reason why. I might completely be overstating the situation here, but when I read through it, I wasn't convinced or certain that this was to regulate what you call quota licenses only. And in my mind recently, because of what we've been through with the pandemic, a lot of the governor's orders early on, and of course we had so many orders, I think we're up to 50 or 60 something now, dealt with whether you're a restaurant or bar depended on your liquor to food sales ratios. And if you were within a certain ratio, you couldn't sell anything. And if you were below a certain ratio, you could. And then they changed it to where you could actually sell drinks that were covered and take them out and things of that nature. So I really haven't looked at it. I don't pretend to be a liquor law expert. But if this is intended to just talk about quota licenses, there may be a reason that we want to be specific to that, so we don't run into a problem with restaurants that we actually want them to have the full bar.
Okay, and then one last thing, I know when Mayor said we don't want to have 40 alcohol licenses, full bar licenses, I agree. But also I think we have to sit down and actually look at where we want the beach to be in 20 years as informed as how many licenses should we have? And obviously we're reviewing this now. Should we add, allow 2-3 more in the next 20, 30 years? That is something I guess we're going to have to talk about. I mean, I don't want to see Jack's Beach just be nothing but bars, in 20, 30 years, but I also want to see it progress. So I guess that's something that we're going to have to talk about a little bit more.
I have my hand up, so I'll just speak up. So I can almost say with 100% certainty that this was very intentional, that this was passed at the time it was because the community wanted to limit the number of bars that we had to 12. So I guess my question would be if, I realize there's some interest in discussing this and discussing whether it's changed, but if we don't change it, is it appropriate to, instead of referencing population and census, just say that we are limiting the number of liquor licenses or whatever the proper reference would be to 12?
Oh, Cliff, you're muted.
The answer is yes, there's a way to do that, but what we need to make sure that what we come up with is defensible and not seen as somehow discriminatory or whatever. So there'd be a little bit of research to associate with it, but yeah, there's a way to do it. Now I finally figured out where to see the hands up, so I'm thinking I'm really advancing. And I see that Mr. Stokes has his hand up.
I do, yes. Two thoughts is first is, I think it does need an update. Just in reading it, it dates our charter. It makes you realize how old our charter is and how little it's been updated. And then also just thinking when this was done in 1950, alcohol was kind of viewed a little bit differently. You can tell just in the way that it's written, the liquors or whiskey, intoxicating liquors. So I don't know what the magic number is. I think that we need to have that discussion, but I think that in 2021 and beyond, that alcohol is definitely viewed differently than it was in 1950. Second thought that I had while reading this whole section is this, just putting this regulating the number of licenses in section 2 is kind of strikes as odd, because it's the whole language except for the part on the liquor license is all about city powers, and it just talks. I'm just wondering, is there a reason to leave this in section 2 or create a whole new section regarding?
Just so you know, Chet, this was done as a charter amendment, so it was voted on by the citizens, and so I think at the time that was somebody determined that was the place to put it.
Okay. that would make sense, because there's no, usually on the amendments, there's a, where it's been put in there. So that would be my only question, is it just strikes me strange that it's talking about all governmental, corporate, proprietary powers, conduct municipal government, then it goes to talk about liquor licenses, but not talk about any other power. So that was my only second thought.
If there was a desire of the council to pull it out and have it its own section, that's not a difficult ask. So it can be done if that's what you decide once we figure out which direction you want to head in. The next hand I see up is Mr. Jansen.
Yeah, just real quick, Sandy, do you know when that amendment was voted on by chance? Do you know what year?
I don't, but I want to say it was 1957, and that's why they referenced the 1950 census. Maybe Mayor Hoffman knows from.
Okay, so it's been a long time though.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
For some reason, 1957 is coming to my mind, but that may not be correct. Mayor Hoffman may know.
I don't know offhand.
The next hand I see up is Mr. Meza.
Question, Mr. Shepherd. In your experience, how often do cities or municipalities review their charters? And do you think it's a good idea to add into the charter to where it lets the future council members to review the charter, let's say every 10, 15, 20 years instead of half a century?
First of all, there is no norm for this. One of the cities that I represent that's also going through this right now and choosing to do it with me simply being available for consultation whenever they need it. So I don't have to go to those meetings. They just send me what they want me to find out after the meetings. So you can tell that means they didn't particularly follow my advice on how to go about it. But I was in a city which was regulated in the charter, and it's one of the things they ultimately changed that required them to do the charter review like every 3 years. And so those are the extremes, with one that is doing the first charter review that it's done since I was there, and I've been there as a city attorney since 2002, and it's going through it right now. And other city has, like I said, had it mandated in their charter to do it 3 times, every 3 years, excuse me. And that's where I got significant charter review experience until they finally got smart and said, you know, this is kind of silly to have all these people sit here and talk every 3 years about something we just got used to having in the charter. And they changed it. I don't know whether they went to 5 or 7 years, but something longer. You know, if you're asking me what I think is a reasonable number every 5 years, and you could say, well, that seems too often. But again, one of the nice things about doing it on a more frequent basis is you don't have so much heavy lifting to do as if you've waited 15 or 20 years. And so there may be very few, if any, changes, and that's okay, but at least you've taken a look at it to see how it looks compared to current standards. And as you all know, obviously on things like gender neutrality and other things that would have seemed insane to the people who wrote the charter in the 1950s are part of everyday life today. And so I don't know that we're going to find those things here necessarily, but the point is, if you on a more frequent review schedule, whether it's by adopted ordinance or by charter itself, you can put it in the charter, because you don't have to do everything that you want to do in the charter by a charter change. You can say we're going to review the charter every 5 years and put that in an ordinance. So you can do that, or every 7 or whatever the time is that's appropriate for you. And that's a reasonable way to go about it. But again, from my perspective, having been through it, I think it's quicker and less heavy lifting if issues are reviewed on a more regular basis because of the keeping up with sort of the modern think of whatever it is. And if an issue comes up, any issue that one of my cities that's going to have a charter amendment on the ballot next time has to do with, and this is an unfortunate issue, but has to do with penalties that should be applied to a council person for violating the charter. And they have been very concerned about a specific member of the council, and there's nothing in the charter that gives them any teeth to do anything about that. So they're going to, not as a part of a regular charter review, but as a special amendment, propose that this penalty provision be added to their charter. So understand that in addition to these thorough front to back charter reviews, at any time something comes up that's community specific and timely, you can put a specific amendment on the ballot at that time. All right, I see Ms. Dumont has her hand up.
Thank you. I know Jacksonville does a 10-year charter review, and I like the 10-year versus the 5 because it overlaps councils. And so it's cleaner with, since we have the term limits currently until we get to sections 3 and on the mayor and the council terms. As of this moment in time, the 10 years would bring new life into the review versus a 5-year review with just, you know, statistically speaking, there's very little change over on a council within 5 years.
Again, this is all a matter of what is your personal preference as a body. And as I said, the key to it all is if something comes up which needs immediate attention based on something that was unanticipated, you can always pose a specific amendment to deal with that specific issue, much like just at the beginning of last year, I guess it was, we did the amendment just related to the city attorney and the city manager, I think it was. I don't see any more hands. Are we all done with this topic for now?
If we are done, I don't know what what we've decided on it. I'd like a decision on what it is that we want to do with this. Are we going to bring it back? So on the first one, we decided to bring that back to a council briefing to decide what the process would be if we want to have workshops with the community and all that. Here we've talked about changing it and how we could possibly change it, and we don't have the data, but we haven't discussed how we will readdress it. Would this include possibly a 14th meeting instead of just a 13th for the charter review? And in the 14th, we come back to the city name change, possibly, and the liquor licenses, because we do not have the data that we need to be able to make a sound decision on this now, other than we think that 1950 sounds outdated. And that's not a reason to change the charter. The charter is your constitution. It is your structure of your government. It guides all the decision making. So I would feel more comfortable before we move to section 3 if we decide what are our next steps with section 2.
Okay, I see Mr. Jansen has his hand up.
Yeah, I think it's more than just the name, the 1950. I think the community has changed. The population has changed. The face of the community has changed. The businesses have changed. A lot has changed in more than 50 years, 70 years. So I think there's more there than just a name. And back to the mayor's original statement, I think there's a fine balance in there. And maybe I don't want to put a number out there, but maybe we're a few licenses short of where we really should be versus, you know, looking at our population 70 years later versus where we're sitting right now. And I also agree that we shouldn't open up the floodgates and have 44 of them. That's for sure. But I think there's probably a nice balance in there. I think we're antiquated just on face value.
And I see Ms. Hoffman.
Considering we're on the first page of our charter review, I am very comfortable with the concept of how I mentioned earlier, a parking lot, knowing that there are going to be some things that might stack up that we're going to need to revisit. And I don't expect us to know exactly what that's going to look like at this moment, but I think the commitment is that I think it sounds like everyone is interested in revisiting this, and we can figure out the technicalities of that later. But I think we need to get a little further into one page and a little more into the kind of the groove of this process before we put anything in stone.
I think that's wise, just for the sake of what we ordinarily have in these situations, and we're not in non-COVID times, is we have the meetings like this, but we're face-to-face, and then you have a real robust opportunity for public input, and the public knows what's coming. In this case, there's a little bit less opportunity for that, although they're certainly welcome to participate via this platform. It's not as easy, and it's kind of a little bit bulky for this kind of a discussion. So I think that's probably wise. And if the parking lot gets too crowded and you need more spaces, then you go ahead and pull the trigger on a special meeting or some sort of workshop or a briefing so that you can keep the agenda manageable, and then start another parking lot if needed as we go through the other sections. Okay, I have Mr. Stokes.
Thanks. My question's for Cliff and Mike. Just wondering who is doing research for kind of some of these topics, if we're left to our own devices or we have maybe a staff member or something helping, because I think what would be very helpful when we come back in the parking lot is possibly have some comparatives from other cities of the same size and how they operate their licensing. And maybe when we look at what other cities are doing, we'll realize that we're doing the same thing, or we realize that we need some more update. Because I would like to know what another city that's roughly 9 square miles and 24,000 people is doing for their how their liquor licenses are regulated.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of them are by population, but it'd just be nice to have a little bit more data for review when we do it.
To answer your question, Chet, all of staff, particularly the department directors in the clerk's office, are all prepared to provide whatever support is necessary for council to make the right decisions as to how they want to move forward with the charter. I can tell you that we've been doing an exercise now. We just started at our leadership meetings of breaking the charter down by each of the 13 meetings and assigning department directors to review different sections to see what recommendations might be for those particular sections as we move forward. This first one was kind of a wild card because we didn't know how the meeting was going to go or how the formats were going to be conducted. And while we can do comparables to other communities, I think it's also important to understand that the goals of the communities, the demographics, the geographic location may all play into why their charter is structured the way they are structured. So as an example, the city of Jacksonville Beach being 8 square miles, high density with 2 CRAs and a downtown entertainment district may be completely different than Winter Park, may be completely different than St. Pete Beach, based on the values that those communities are trying to achieve. So while we can provide you with comparables, I still think the overarching final decisions will come down to what this council believes is in the best interest of the city going forward with regards to how you want it structured. I'm hearing at least a little consensus amongst the council that there may be a desire to allow some additional licenses for Quota, but the number is unknown at this point as to how many that would be. There seems to be a universal desire to change the language that's in the charter now to be much more clear as to what it addresses. Not necessarily the intoxicating liquors or whiskey, but maybe make it a little bit more relevant to contemporary language or wording that's used in current state statute. And there may be even a desire to break it out and have it be its own section, as opposed to lumping it into the enumerated powers. So as we move closer and start funneling down towards focal points, as council says they want additional information and they tell us what they want, we'll hopefully either be proactively bringing it to the conversation or bringing it to the next meeting, or how we decide to handle it subsequent to the initial meeting being held. So for tonight, as an example, we had Chief Smith put together the listing of those establishments that currently have the Quota licenses. We knew how many were with the 4 COP SRX extension, but we just aren't sure where the conversation was going to go from there. If all of you had said leave it alone, we'd be done with the topic. Now that we know you want to redress it, now we know we need to get additional information.
And Mike, I'll add this from the legal perspective. I have the ability to go out, or the resources, I should say, to go out and find out what other communities are doing, if anything, because there may be an assumption that other communities are limiting licenses in a similar manner, and there may not be that many that do. I just don't know. Or they may make a distinction. You mentioned CRAs. Obviously, for many of the areas that I represent, and I do CRAs all over the state, their CRAs are specifically designed to attract adult nighttime entertainment and all the things associated with it. So the more bars, the better. And entertainment establishments that serve a lot of alcoholic beverages, the better. But that may be limited. They may have a limit for that area that's significantly different than other areas of the city. So all of those things are on the table. But one of the things that I may have mentioned to you all before, because attorneys are not known for being particularly innovative, we have a listserv for municipal lawyers, and that listserv allows us to reach out to all our companion municipal lawyers across the state and say, hey, how does your city handle this issue, if at all? And please send me a link. And in very short order, there are some regulars on that list that will supply me everything I wanted to know and way more than I want to know. Ms. Golden, I see your hands up.
Thank you. I just wanted to make some comments regarding getting more information. To me, it seems that it would be helpful perhaps to, I know we're talking about putting this in a parking lot, but I think it might be helpful to have some discussion, and maybe it's in the format of a briefing, to talk about what is the information we'd like to have so that we can discuss this a little bit in more detail. So I could see us having a meeting to do that, to come up with what are the things that we'd like to see so that we can give the staff some direction on what information to gather. And then the only other comment I would make is that, you know, I would just say that we could loosen the number of licenses, but I am of the opinion that we will probably still have a situation where the licenses would become high valued, and we'd be right back where we were with, you know, not having enough licenses, or people feeling that there aren't enough licenses, or whatever the case may be. So to me, my concern is that we can increase that number, but I don't think that'll ever fix the problem of you know, those licenses becoming expensive or sought after. That's just my personal opinion. And so I think we have to look at what's best for the community, you know, regardless of, you know, what happens with the value of the licenses.
I don't see any more hands up at the moment, but what I understand, and I'll recap it, and if hand goes up, I'll certainly stop. But the recap it seems like to me that at a future briefing, maybe some further direction. I think Mike has a fairly good idea of where this is headed, because his summary was exactly the same as mine would have been at that particular point. But perhaps the council briefing, if there's any additional direction to staff regarding information you won't return, he can get that information that he needs, and any information that he needs from me, and we certainly can get that back to you pretty quickly. And so that shouldn't be a problem. And I don't see any more hands at the moment. So now do we go to section 3? Okay, I'm going to assume, unless someone says yes.
Oh, I was going to go to 3.
Okay, here we go. All right. In section 3, and I thought that was going to be the one that took a while. In section 3, the first thing I noted a number of things here for different reasons. Again, I don't have a strong feeling about any of them, and that's always going to be the case because that's not my role. My role is kind of to direct your attention to things that I see, and then let you all take it from there, much like we did before. The first thing I have highlighted is where it talks about a term shall be considered a full term if the elector has served 2 or more years of their 4-year term. And I'm going to take each one of these one at a time. So if you drop below in the format that I've used, areas for discussion, I put in 2 or more years of their first 4-year term and any portion of their second consecutive 4-year term. Now, the reasons for this, as I put down below, is that it would eliminate potential incentive to resign before completion of half of the second term, thereby being eligible to run in 2 years for another 4-year term. This is being raised under the theory that, and trust me, recently my life is full of these theories, anything that can happen will. Anything that you think will never happen, it happens. I just can't explain it. It's like the universe and the planets align. And I've experienced attempts to manipulate term limits in other jurisdictions, including literally right now it's happening. And so whether or not you want to do anything about this, the reason why I made the suggestion, particularly limited to the second term being the one where manipulation could occur, is because, again, that's what's happening now. You would think that someone who says 2 or more years of their 4-year term makes it a full term would be sufficient disincentive for them to quit 1 day shy of that 2-year time frame, and then and be done, and they would just go ahead and serve out their full second term. Don't bet on it. And so what I'm telling you is possible, the way it's written now, is that 1 4-year term and almost 2 years of a second term, if a person quits under or resigns under the current structure, by the end of that, what would have been the full term, they can run again. Or whenever the next election is for an open seat, because they're not term limited out, based on the way it's currently structured. And it seems maybe a stretch until it actually happens, which I'm dealing with now.
I'm just going to say brilliant.
So, yeah. So that's something for y'all to discuss, or not. If you want to not, if you want to discuss it, we'll stop here while that takes place, or I can go ahead through all the other changes of the section. What is your pleasure?
How would you suggest to narrow?
Well, my suggestion is that when you get into the final term, and this prevents any manipulation of the system, is that if you serve even 1 day of the second consecutive term, that's a full term, and you are term limited out for a full 4 years, as if you'd served the full 4 sitting there. Now, that may seem harsh, but the idea is you're trying to stop, essentially, some people would argue, bad conduct. And so you take the strongest possible measure. If you're going to try to get reelected and then in 2 years step aside so that you can run again, just short of 2 years under the way it's currently written, so you can run again, and based on name recognition, people might not even know you aren't still on council. There's just a number of different ways that system can be manipulated, and it may never be, but in my lifetime, these things have happened, and more than once, unfortunately.
Doesn't this come into play where it won't happen with City of Jacksonville Beach, but if a city has a council and they're receiving a salary that has a pension tied to it, I think they have to do on their second term 2 years and a day in order to capture that pension. So that might come into play, but it won't happen for us. So it might be a moot point.
Yeah, I don't even, frankly, I'm not sure. I'd have to check. I've never heard that any of my cities offer those kind of benefits to their former council persons, but there is one of them that provides the ability to have health insurance. So, I don't know how that ties into specific personnel situations with Jack's Beach.
We offer health insurance, not pension.
Okay.
So the health insurance is there. And I think what Mr. Jansen's talking about is Jacksonville, where you start tapping into the pension system once you're on council. And so you see a lot of leaders in Jacksonville go from council to other officials to stay in the pension system until they can vest.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me get I put my hands up and down screen.
Has her hand raised?
Let me, where did it go?
The mayor has her hand
there it
raised.
Is. Yes, I see it now. It had disappeared off my screen. Okay, yes, Mayor Hoffman.
So is this for only your term limited out for your seat? Because I feel like we've had people term limited out of their seat, take 2 years off, and then run for either an at-large or a district seat. Sandy,
Well-
am I making that up? I think we've had that recently.
Yeah, that's permitted. That is permitted. Yeah, and that
Okay.
is permitted, but this is, I think this is like, because you could, I think maybe what Cliff is talking about is potentially run again for that seat, for that matter.
Yes. And again, this is like, it sounds bizarre until you've seen it actually happen, and I have. And so I'm jaded in that regard. But at the end of the day, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So yeah, because it's currently structured, you can be a council person for a total of essentially 8 years, 2 4-year terms, and then run for mayor for another total, potentially, if you served it all the way, 8 years, 2 4-year terms. However, you could do the 2 years, the 8 years as council, do 6 years as mayor, or just short of 6 years, resign, and then at the end, run it. You wouldn't have been term limited the way this is written now, because it's not a full term. You haven't served a full 2 terms in office. You've served basically 1 and a little bit less than a half.
Okay.
And so,
I
Cliff,
got
maybe
that
the-
part of it.
Maybe,
But I'm just-
I'm sorry, go ahead, ma'am.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Maybe the overarching question for council is there a desire to change this section so that no individual serves more than 2 terms as a council member, whether consecutive or not? That you can serve a total of 2 terms on council and 2 terms on mayor, and as mayor, and that's it.
Okay, yeah, because your first statement was just council and not mayor, and you can only do it. So you're talking about both council and mayor. So, let me pick,
Separating the 2.
Sandy. I'm gonna pick on you, Sandy. So Sandy does her 8 years, takes 2 to 4 years off to, sail the world with her dogs and save puppies and kitties all over the place, comes back. And with your suggestion, Mike, she would not be able to run for council again. So it's 2 terms and done.
Well,
We made that suggestion in Jacksonville, and it was dead in the water.
that was a question for council, is the intention of this language to keep an individual from serving more than 2 terms on council, or specifically to eliminate them from, or to specifically restrict them to no more than 2 consecutive terms? And if it's truly the 2 consecutive, then I like what Cliff is proposing, which is language that tightens up what defines 2 consecutive terms. But if the council says someone can run for office for a council seat every other term and serve a total of 6 or 8 terms over their lifespan, if that's what they want to do and you're fine with it, then that's okay. And then the focus can be just on the 2 consecutive terms.
I'm fine with that. And they still have to get elected. So I agree with the consecutive term language.
Can I have clarity there, Chris? Do you mean the consecutive term language as written or as suggested by Cliff?
As suggested.
Okay, thank you.
all right, I see, it seems like that Ms. Golden has her hand up again.
Yeah, I wanted to add in response to what Mike was saying that my understanding was that at the time that this was passed, the intention was to allow consecutive terms and to even allow council to mayor consecutive terms, so that you could have up to 16 years that you're serving consecutively. That was the original intent. And I'm fine with that. And like Mayor Hoffman said, I'm fine with that, with the changes that Cliff suggested, so that you don't have any abuse of that.
If there's nobody else with any comments, that's that first one. I see a hand for Mr. Stokes.
Yeah, just to get clarification, I liked the I liked your area of discussion to eliminate a loophole for people trying to consecutively run for more than 2 terms. I was I guess I got a little confused in all the conversation, because we mentioned where you could run, like I'm currently at large, so I could do my 8 years, take 2 years off, and then run district. I don't see a huge problem with that. I don't know if that was part of the change that we were looking to make. No, okay, I see Chris.
No, because they wouldn't be consecutive. So that's
Okay.
the piece
Yes.
my brain missed.
Okay, that's where I was getting confused with the consecutive, non-consecutive. We got a little crazy there for a sec. So.
That was my point. I mean, that's what I was trying to say too. At the time that the charter was changed to limit to 2 terms on council and then 2 terms on mayor, that was the intent, and that it was okay to have gaps but then run again.
And of course, what this is addressing is how you cover what is a full term. And that's the definition. So whether you're running for mayor, what is a full term, or council person, what is a full term? And so for the first if you're talking about consecutive terms, 2 or more years works, because we're not talking about running again and where you would avoid being term limited out. There's no reason for you to quit early in the first term unless you just want to quit. But in the second term, and now realizing that term limits are coming your way, there is the opportunity to manipulate the system a little bit and then run what would have been essentially for a re-election at the end of the full 4 years of the second 4 years, even though you already served almost half of that second term and shouldn't be running at all. So that's what we're trying to address here. I don't see any more hands going once, twice. Okay, so the next change that I had suggested is the gender neutrality on the forfeit his office. And I could do, and certainly you can have discussions about what you'd like here, his/her, but we even have issues now with gender pronouns. And so I just said forfeit that office. And if you'll see the area for discussion, it's a strike through is what I'm suggesting you might want to change. And then the underline is what I'm suggesting you might want to substitute in.
I'm fine with that.
I see a lot of head nodding. I think you have a consensus there, Cliff.
Okie dokie.
Actually, just to make this simple for Cliff, as we go through this document, does the council agree that we should be looking at gender neutrality through the whole document? All right, Cliff, we just made that easier for you.
Okay, great. All right, so the next thing that I had that I hope you can see on your screen now is there was a reference when it comes to council members' pay being compatible with salaries as portrayed by the Florida League of Municipalities. So stopping there, that doesn't exist anymore, at least under that name. It's the Florida League of Cities. And so my suggestion here is, while I have no problem with data from the Florida League of Cities, my thought is, why limit yourself to one data set? And instead, get data from whatever source you can get it that gives you an idea of what's out there if you're looking for comparisons. And so that's my reason for discussion. No need to be tied to one source of data, which may not be current. And then the name is the Florida League of Cities. And my suggestion or areas for discussion is to simply change cities of comparable size as opposed to portrayed by blah, 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 blah. So I would strike the language as portrayed by the Florida League of Municipalities. So it just reads compatible with salaries for cities and cities or comparable size for cities. Excuse me, what did I say here? For cities, God, it's scrolling up and down. I keep missing myself. Cities of comparable size and form of government is how it would read. Taking out in full the reference to as portrayed by the Florida League of Municipalities and changing the and to or.
It looks like you have
excuse me.
Looks like you have a consensus on that as well, Cliff.
All right.
And just as an aside for council, Karen Nelson did get the latest information from Florida League of Cities for communities, population size 15 to 40,000. And sure enough, they're all over the board, but you guys are kind of right in the middle.
All right. So the last thing in section 3 of our journey today is the last sentence, which says the council may provide members shall receive an allowance for expenses incurred in the performance of their duties. And I suggest for discussion addition of the language to the extent permitted by Florida law. Now, that compliance with the Florida law is always implied in anything. So I'm certainly not a believer in overkill. But the reasons why I think it's worthwhile to consider, or at least discuss putting that language here, is because there are people who, you know, you guys have maybe had your ethics training and you know what's what, and certainly Mike does. And if they consult with a city attorney or with me, I can tell you what's what. But if you don't know, and again, I hate to say, this is all from not only my long experience, but actual recent experience of people getting in office and sort of behaving like a bull in a china closet without realizing that their life has changed permanently as long as they're in office from what they can and can't accept. And so I could envision a circumstance as was going through my head that someone would come to council and say, hey, listen, I've been offered an opportunity to be comped by this vendor to go do this and reimburse me for this trip. And the city looking at this provision of the charter saying, hey, we are going to authorize you to receive an allowance for expenses. And hey, if we don't have to pay it, that's all the better because it'll be paid by this vendor. But there's an ethical problem with that. And so while that may seem an extreme example, it's what was going through my mind. And so by adding the reference to the extent permitted by Florida law, I would hope that it would give somebody like a heads up that, hey, this may not be a limited discretion here. We may need to make sure that what we're doing fits within the current rules of ethics and gift laws and so forth. I'm not seeing any hands, so either I put you to sleep or we're good.
I agree. I just had a conversation with a council member from another municipality. I'm not going to note which, but they are dealing with a lot of these same issues. So I am very comfortable with that new language being added.
Okay. I don't see any more hands. So Mike, unless you have anything more, I think I'm concluded. Now, it would be my intention going forward, subject to any additional instructions, which you can lay to me now, or you can lay through Mike later, that this format works for you to provide in each set of sections that we review, what are my areas for discussion, the reasons why I'm bringing up the discussion. But I'm also going to tell you that, as you already know anyway, that it is not up to me to tell you everything you need to know about your charter. I am unaware, like I was tonight, about the sensitivity of the alcohol issue. I just knew to raise it as a discussion point. And that'll be many of the issues in your charter that I don't know where, what screws need to be tightened and what needs to be loosened. So that means to you, essentially, that me doing my work doesn't mean you don't have to do your homework. And I'm not trying to imply that you would do it that way. I am trying to say that I don't want to miss something that's important to you because I simply don't know that it's important to you. And I will continue, if you like the format, to present what I have based on the experience that I have. But obviously, if there's something that's relevant to that needs to be brought up, by all means, bring it to the table. And if we're not ready to go through it, we'll do what we did before, which we'll put in the parking lot. I see a hand by Ms. Golding.
Yeah, so Cliff, I like what you did and how you presented the suggestions. And is that something that you could potentially send to us, say, a few days in advance so that we can at least review it? And then that way we might have a little more meaningful input, and actually have some time to digest the suggestions too.
Yeah, and the reason that didn't happen this time is completely on me. I actually did not realize, and that's, again, it's all me. I did not realize that as the agenda was set up, because I literally didn't look at it till like 2:30 or whenever Jacob sent it to me, that I was the meeting. I thought I was going to sit there and be on the sidelines while y'all figured out what you wanted to do, and I would just be the scribe and answer legal questions. So then when I realized, oh, wait a minute, I am the meeting, that's when I said, okay, well, I better start putting something together. So it will be my full intention in the future and we can use an agenda deadline that Mike gives me, whether it's the Wednesday before or 48 hours, whatever he thinks is appropriate, and I'll do that. But I will follow the same format so that you'll see the sections as they read, highlight the portions that I think need to be discussed, and then my suggestions for how you may want to formulate the discussion. And then if we get into that further, from my own personal experience, why I think it's worthy of the discussion.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not fussing or complaining at all. I actually like what you did, and so yeah, I'd appreciate that if you could send us something in advance. That'd be
no
great.
problem.
48 hours at least would be great for me. I don't know how anyone else feels
I could do
about
it longer. I could have done it longer here. God knows this one I had plenty of advance notice. It didn't click to me that I was running the meeting because I don't typically run the meetings.
Can I just have a little clarity to close up this meeting? So on section 1 of the charter, it's a revisit, comes back to us in a briefing, then we decide if we want to go to workshops. Section 2 comes back to us in a briefing and with data. Well, in the briefing, we decide what data we need to be able to make a good decision on section 2. So those are the 2 in the parking lot, and you promise not to let the parking lot get too full. Section 3, we have made a decision to revise the 2 consecutive terms so that the first term is still the same. The second term would start on day 1, and if you were to resign anytime in your second term, it's considered a complete term. Gender neutrality, not just for section 3, but throughout the charter. So you got the charge on the gender neutrality there. And then with regard to council salaries, cities of comparable size and form of government. That's what I have as deliverables from this meeting. I just want to make sure I'm on the right page and my notes are complete.
I believe so, and let me suggest to you that that's a very important part. I will have a running log, if you will. The reason I went ahead and suggested language for the things that I brought up is that if that language was acceptable, then everything writes itself. What you'll see at the end of this process, and I think it was fairly spelled out to you when we discussed it, when y'all were considering how to proceed, is an ordinance to send it to the voters. And if we have agreed, there will be a place, again, to address these things because they'll all be rolled into an ordinance as questions, summaries, and actual amendment language. So you have the ballot title, the summary: shall the city of Jack's Beach charter be amended to say, or San Pedro, or whatever name you are at that time, San Pablo, and shall it be changed to be such and such, yes or no? And then underneath that is the entirety of the change in context, so someone reading it. Now that's not what shows up on the ballot, but that is so in the ordinance, anybody who reads the ordinance can see the full amendment, not just the summary and the title. On the ballot itself, so I'm sure you've seen it before, the amendment might be 500 words long, but the ballot and summary, the title is 15 words and the summary is no more than 75. So that's why that's kind of where I come in, is I have to accurately summarize so it passes legality, everything that's in the however many words thereafter, so that it'll pass muster if there's a legal challenge. That's my problem. But at the end of the day, I'll keep a running tally and I'll be bringing back to you along the way, here's the way the actual amendment will be with strike through and underline, meaning underline for new, strike through for take out. And here's my initial draft of the summary and the title for that ballot question as we determine them.
And each change goes on the ballot as its own individual item, correct?
Well, the answer is that is my suggestion. If we were talking about the Florida state constitution, or if your charter were written differently, the answer is you'd be limited to that by single subject. At the Florida constitutional level, it is required. But at the municipal level, unless your charter requires single subject, you don't have to. But it is obviously my strong recommendation that you do that. There is the one exception would be gender neutrality, because you're going to be amending a lot of sections that deal with that. But the question will be, shall the Jacksonville Beach Charter be amended in every spot necessary to achieve gender neutrality, yes or no? But then the actual amendment, you can imagine, might be quite long. But as for other things like what we've talked about today in section 3, those should be up to y'all, but my suggestion is it be single questions so that you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. If you don't like one thing, you don't have to throw out the rest.
And Cliff, you brought up a topic, or you're discussing a topic that I think is probably ripe for a question. Obviously, there's the possibility that there's going to be multiple ballot questions for citizens of Jacksonville Beach to vote upon. We do have 66 sections within our charter. In your professional opinion, what is a reasonable number of ballot initiatives to have in any individual election for a charter change without overwhelming the public and getting to the point where they have fatigue and don't want to vote on all the items?
If I could tell you the answer, I'd also be picking my lottery numbers. You know, there's the old story about the man who constantly prays to God for the winning lottery ticket. And at some point, God says, after years and years of hearing the same prayer, hey, look, you got to do me a favor and buy a ticket. So at the end of the day, all I can tell you is longer is not your friend. If there is a way to combine like with like, even though it violates my single subject issue, if they are related, such that if you change one part, it makes sense that you be changing another part, you might cut down the number of questions by doing that. But this is why more frequent, whether that's 5 or 10 or 7 or some other number, amendment versus long periods where you then have longer ballots to deal with is, you know, it can be an advantage. But there's no magic number. I will hope that we will have sections tonight or as we go forward that don't require amending, at least not now. But we also may make a value judgment, right? We may go through and say, based on what's important to us substantively, even though we see where this could be amended just to shorten the ballot, we will leave it off for now. That's your call. You'll be presented with the option to put all or nothing or some version in between. And that's one of the reasons why I had suggested early on that the decision-making be left at your level so that you didn't have to disappoint some member of a citizen-appointed charter review who said, well, that was my thing. I really wanted that thing. Yeah, but there's not room. You know, so that's one of the reasons why I suggested that. Mayor, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for jumping in and guiding us through this process. You're really helping us go through it really smoothly, especially for our first time out. And to that point, I think that you know, when we get to the end and we look at the list, we can certainly prioritize and maybe push things off for 2 years from now, like we did. You know, we've already had 2 items on the ballot as part of our charter review. So it might make sense to spread that out a little bit, especially since it has been so long since this has been done. And then I just wanted to point out to my colleagues that if you hadn't gotten that far or noticed already, section 50 addresses the quota license again. So it's actually in our charter twice. So that might be the logical next time it comes up.
Well, for consistency purposes, we want to make sure that we go ahead and look at it early to make sure that what we're thinking about now is consistent with what we may be thinking about in the future. Mike, I don't see any more hands at the moment, so I'm going to hand it back to you, and you can tell me if we have anything else to discuss or go over, or we can call it a night.
I don't think we have anything more to discuss tonight. I guess the question for council would be, with regards to the name change briefing is obviously going to be a standalone topic. So we'll go ahead and schedule that accordingly. For the purposes of discussing section 2 regarding the quota licenses, would you like us to try and fit that in at next Monday's briefing, just to at least see if over the weekend you've had some thoughts as to what types of information you might need for further consideration? Karen's going to be running that particular briefing, but if we limit it to what pieces of information do you think you will need, then that gives both Cliff and I something to work off of. So maybe that's a starting point prior to bringing it back to a full briefing topic. But that would be my hope, is that we can just put an item on there. You can take a few days to think about it and then tell us what you want to look at. I'm seeing some heads nodding, so that sounds good. Karen can hate me later.
Mike, real quick, since we're a little ahead of schedule, you had mentioned 3 things that we kind of had come to a consensus on. And I'm like, Councilmember Dumont, I like to take notes. Would you just review those? I got that we need change. It's a maybe antiquated language, possibly add new licenses, and possibly move out of section 2. Is that some good kind of summary?
That's where I saw some heads nodding and I heard multiple comments along those lines. So I think that's the starting of the funneling effect. And then the question becomes, where does it land? And so.
And check, do you have the, be more clear on the type of license?
Yeah, I think everyone's on the same page with that the intoxicating liquors and whiskey is not in alignment with current state
Right, I just wanted to make sure it was in his notes too. I have a little star on it by mine.
I didn't have it, so I appreciate that.
So are you all happy with the format of meeting 1? I see heads nodding. Okay, this is a council priority project, so we're going to move forward. So with that being said, that ends for tonight. Think about the information you need with regards to the liquor quota licenses for Monday, and we will go ahead and set up a separate briefing for name change discussion. And then we have our next meeting for charter review is scheduled on Thursday, May 27th. We will be discussing sections 4 through 7, and that will also be a 5:30 Zoom meeting. So we will try to get you that information in advance, not just Cliff's information with his discussion topics, but if there's also any input from staff, we will combine it with Cliff's document to provide to you. And with that being said, I think we're done for this evening. Good first meeting, everybody.
Good deal. Thank you all.